Hey guys, a lot of people do a blank before the end of blank, like a 25 to read before the end of 2025 or 26 to read in 2026, but I don't read that much. So I'm just gonna do 10 before the end. So these are the 10 books I want to read before the end of 2026. Except it's actually kind of 12 because I have two authors that I want to read from, and I didn't include it in my list of 10 because I already had 10 and I didn't want to cut anything out. I'm still getting over being sick, so I apologize for my voice, but I really wanted to get this out there before it was too far into the year. So before I get into the books that I want to read before the end of 2026, I wanted to go over some goals that I have for 2026 and some stats from 2025 about those goals, if that makes sense. For some stats about my reading in 2025, I read 55 books, of which I rated 53 of them, and about 20% of my reading last year was in translation, which I was very happy with. I didn't make that a goal last year. I just kind of picked up the books that I wanted to read. I don't imagine that there will be much of a change in that for this year, so I'm not worried about keeping that up in the new year. About 75% of the books that I read were written by women. Also a stat that I'm pretty happy with, and again, I'm not going to make any goal in that. I don't expect that to change much. About 60% of the books were from authors from outside of the US. Yeah, I just thought that was an interesting stat. About 60% of the authors I read from were not American authors. So now going on to the stats that I do want to do something about, I think it's important to reflect on the books that I read this past year, and if there is a discrepancy in how I want to be reading, I want to put it in my goals and actually make an effort to change that. Only about 5% of the books I read were written by queer authors, and less than 20% were written by authors of color or non-white authors. And those are both things that I want to work on. I just want to make sure that I'm reading diversely. In addition to that, only about 10% of the books I read were written before I was born, so before 1998. And I think there's a lot you can learn from older books. So I want to make an effort to read from older books this year. And that goes pretty well into my first goal of the year, which is to read more classics. This past year, I read a few books that I think could be considered modern classics, but I want to read more classics this year. As I mentioned, I want to read more diverse authors, which means more non-white queer authors. So those are authors I'm going to be intentionally seeking out. Obviously, I'm still going to be reading the books that I was reading before, but I just want to be aware of the content that I'm consuming. I'm happy with the amount of books that I read that were in translation this past year, but I didn't do any reading outside of English. And so one goal that I have for this coming year is I want to read 3 books in a foreign language, probably 2 in French, because that's a language that I already speak and I'm already comfortable reading in. But I want to read 1 book, even if it's just like a children's book or something like that, in a language that I'm actively learning. That is a big goal for me this year, is spending more of my time working on things that make me feel fulfilled and happy instead of scrolling on my phone, which I think a lot of people have that goal. I also want to read more books that were recommended by people I know in real life, especially my mom. She recommends me a lot of books, and I think because she recommends me so many, I don't read many of them. And so I want to make sure that I'm reading the books that are personally recommended to me by people in my life who know me and love me and know my taste. Because as much as I love finding recommendations from people on the internet, I think it's really special when people who know you recommend books specifically for you, and I haven't been taking advantage of that. So that's something that I want to do this year. Another one of my goals this year is to read more nonfiction. I've been working my way through a few nonfiction books, but I don't think I've read an entire nonfiction or memoir or biography this entire year. So that's something that I also want to prioritize this year. My last reading goal of this year is to read more off of my physical TBR. I do read a fair amount off my physical TBR, but since I've been traveling around so much, it's hard to know exactly what I'll want to read and bring the right books for that circumstance. So I've done a lot of reading on my Kindle this year, which is great because I'm using my local library, but I have a whole bookshelf here, and right now I'd say it's at least 50% books that I haven't read. So my last reading goal of this year is to read books off of my physical TBR. And you'll see that in my 10 books that I want to prioritize this year, 7 of them are off my physical TBR. So I'm trying to set myself up for success here by not only choosing books that I already own and will be more likely to read and then don't have to spend money on or wait for the library, but also make some progress in this goal by getting books off my physical TBR. My last kind of bookish related goal isn't actually reading related, but I've been spending a lot of time trying to learn DaVinci Resolve and using like Skillshare to take some classes or to learn from experts on how to really up my editing game. I really love editing. It's what I mostly work with in journalism. That's obviously mostly written and then some audio, but I really want to up my video editing game and I find it really fun. It just is very overwhelming because moving from iMovie to DaVinci Resolve, there's so many more elements in DaVinci Resolve, which is really great because it means that there's so much more I can do with the program, but it's also a lot more intimidating. So those are my reading and kind of reading related goals for this year. And now let's just jump into the books on my 2026 priority TBR. So the first 3 books on my 10 before the end for 2026 are all nonfiction. As you can see, I'm trying to choose books that go towards my goals to kind of set myself up for success. So the first one is Barbarian Days by William Finnegan. This is a memoir by William Finnegan, who is a foreign correspondent and reporter. And from what I understand, his memoir is mostly about his experience surfing all over the world. So those are 2 things that really appeal to me, journalism and surfing. So this seemed like the perfect book for me. I actually got it in a blind date with a book because on the front it was written war reporting, memoir, surfing. And I was like, that's definitely for me. So Barbarian Days by William Finnegan is the first book on my priority 2026 TBR. The next memoir I have is Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. So many people know Trevor Noah. He's a political commentator on The Daily Show and a comedian, and he was born and raised in South Africa, where being mixed race was literally a crime. So his memoir basically takes us through his life from being born in South Africa until being an adult working on one of the most popular talk shows in the US. So that's Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. The final nonfiction I have is Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe. And this is kind of a true crime / history of Northern Ireland during the Troubles in the 70s. It follows a woman, Jean McConville, who was kidnapped from her home in Belfast, Northern Ireland in 1972. And through this crime and kind of trying to figure out what happens, the author also gives a look into the history and conflict in Ireland in the 70s and 80s. I've paired the next 2 books together because they both seem like literary fiction, kind of a mix of literary and historical fiction, and they both seem like slower stories and make me think of summer and being outside, and they seem like the type of books that I want to read when I really want to connect with nature. The first one I don't have physically, I have it on my Kindle, and it's Northwoods by Daniel Mason. And it basically follows a cabin in New England that was built during the time of the Puritans, and then it follows the centuries of people who live there and interact with this cabin. So it feels very much like a slow story set in one place and surrounding one object, which I'm really interested in. A book that I almost put on this list, but I didn't have room for it, was The Overstory by Richard Powers, which seems to do something kind of similar, but instead of following a cabin, it is surrounding a tree and the people who interact with that tree. So back to Northwoods. Corrine on BookTube, she read this book and raved about it, and she's also the one that I got the recommendation for Acqua Viva from, which is one of my best books of the year. So she's someone who I now trust implicitly when it comes to kind of naturey, outdoorsy, lyrical stories. So that's Northwoods by Daniel Mason. So the next book in this vein of like outdoorsy, summer, slow stories is Slanting Towards the Sea by Lydia Hilje. And I actually bought this book when I was in London doing my best bookstores of London video, and it's been staring at me from my shelf ever since. So this book spans 2 decades, and from what I understand, it's a coming of age story about this relationship between these two people, and it's not always romantic. It seems like it's kind of an exploration of love and hope, especially in a country that has just become independent. It's set in Croatia. One of my favorite solo trips that I've ever taken was in Croatia on the coast and then on some of the islands. So I'm really excited to read Slanting Toward the Sea by Lidija Hilje. So the next book on my list is a contemporary literary fiction, and it's a recommendation from my mom and from many people on BookTube, and it's Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. So you've probably heard of this one, and it follows this young man who is obsessed with the idea of martyrs and dying for a cause. From the synopses that I've seen, it seems like he befriends or starts communicating with someone who is terminally ill and has decided to take questions from the public and kind of just talk to anyone about death and about their life and knowing they're going to die. And Cyrus, the main character of this novel, since he's so obsessed with martyrdom and death, he goes and finds this person and talks to them. And that's all I know about it. I just want to go in knowing the little that I know now. And I've heard from basically everyone who's read it that it's a life-changing, mind-blowing book. So that is Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. So the next book I have is another historical fiction, but it's based on a true story, and that's Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. And I believe this is a fictionalized version of the true story of the last woman to be sentenced to death in Iceland. It takes place in Iceland in 1829, and she is accused of murder and sentenced to death in Iceland, but because they're in such a small town, I believe that she has to wait for her execution in a family home. And I believe it just follows her final days and the relationship she builds with this family she's living with, and kind of talks about the different sides to the story. So that's Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. The next book on my list is a horror. It's a historical horror, and I was, again, choosing between this and one other book, and this is The Starving Saints by Caitlin Starling. I know very little about this book, and everything I've heard has been bad, quite honestly, but I'm just so intrigued by both the cover and the storyline that I feel like I have to read it for myself. So from what I know, this follows these people who have been under siege in a castle for months, and they are running out of resources, out of food, etc. And I think they turn to cannibalism, and I've heard it's like fever dreamy and queer and cannibalism, and I'm just really intrigued by it. So I really want to read it this year. The other book that I was tempted to put on this list is Slewfoot by Brom. And the reason that I chose The Starving Saints over Slewfoot is that I know that Slewfoot, the physical version, has really beautiful illustrations, and I really want to read that version. But with like the uncertainty of where I'm going to be over the next year, I don't want to commit to buying any books, at least any physical books. I mean, I'm sure I still will, especially in charity shops, but I think The Starving Saints is one that I'll be able to get from my library and put on my Kindle, and that just seemed like the more sustainable option for me. So that's The Starving Saints by Caitlin Starling. The last two books are both classics. At least one is a classic, the other I'd call it like a dystopian classic, I think. Why not? And that's The Wall by Marlen Haushofer. This is a recommendation from Books with Emily Fox because I read one of my favorite books of 2024, I Who Have Never Known Men, on her recommendation. And she said that this is a book that she read that gave her the same vibes or made her feel the same way. So from what I understand, The Wall is about this middle-aged woman who wakes up one day to realize that everyone else has vanished. I don't know if there's a wall stopping her from getting out to the rest of the world or if just everyone has vanished and she doesn't know anything. But it's basically a survival dystopian novel following this middle-aged woman. But it seems good, and I trust Books with Emily Fox, so I'm going to read it. And the final book on my list is a true classic. It's Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. And this is a book that I read a portion of for my creative writing class during my master's. So I've been kind of waiting for an excuse to read the rest of it. And since it's originally published in French, I'm hoping that this is a book that I can actually read in French. I have the English version here, but I do have the original French version on my Kindle. So I feel like I'll be able to go back and forth between the two if I'm ever lost. And I believe this book is set in France in the 1800s and basically follows this woman who becomes very bored and discontent with her boring provincial life and does something to change that. I'm pretty sure it caused some outcry about obscenity when it was published in like 1850 or whenever it was published. Let me check. 1856 to be precise, which makes me want to read it even more. Because if something outraged men in the 1800s, I want to read it. So this is Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. So those were the 10 books on my priority TBR for 2026. And I have two kind of honorable mentions that I didn't put on the list because they're actually two authors I want to read from, because I would be happy reading any of these authors' books. And the two authors are Charlotte McConaghy and Stephen Graham Jones. I have never read a book by either of these authors. I feel like the books that Charlotte McConaghy writes, which often are nature, mystery, fiction, have the potential to be a new favorite genre or style of mine. So I think any of her three most popular books, Once There Were Wolves, Migrations, or Wild Dark Shore, have the potential to be a book that I really love. So I would love to read a book by Charlotte McConaghy this year. And then, of course, Stephen Graham Jones is kind of a darling of the booktube horror world. I've never read anything by him, but I think his books are generally thriller horror with a big focus on Indigenous culture. And I've just heard amazing things about his books, especially My Heart is a Chainsaw and I Was a Teenage Slasher, and also Buffalo Hunter Hunter. So those are the three books of his that I would be really interested in picking up this year. So if you have any thoughts about which book from Charlotte McConaghy or Stephen Graham Jones I should read, please let me know. I'd also love to know some of your goals for your reading this year. So if you want to share those below, let me know. So thanks for watching. I hope next year around this time I can come back and say that I have read all 10 of these books and loved all of them. And see you next time.